Hi, MRH. This is Miss Brown, and today we are going to be thinking about identifying and curating some artifacts actually having to do with our current experiences living through the COVID-19 pandemic. Um, so you might wonder, why should we think about and create and collect artifacts representing our current experiences in this pandemic? And there are a lot of reasons. One reason is that doing so can just help us to reflect on what we're living through, and there's certainly a lot to reflect on and to process. Another is that doing this can help us to help future historians who will have to look back and understand this unprecedented global event and how it affected people. So the Missouri History Museum and lots of other history museums around the country and around the world are trying to collect stories from people that are living through this pandemic, as we all are, so that they have a collection of firsthand accounts so that future historians will have that as a resource when they have to go back and understand what all of this has been. Now, before we go any further, let's first clarify what is an artifact. Artifacts can be almost anything. Some common types, they can be written documents, letters, lists, emails, text messages, schedules, newspapers. They can also be very formal written documents like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. Artifacts can be images, photos, drawings, paintings, any kind of visual representation of something going on. And artifacts can just be average everyday objects: food, clothing, wrappers, containers, forks, cups, almost anything can be an artifact. What makes it an artifact is if it tells about a specific time or place or event, and how historians can potentially use that artifact to understand that time or place or event. So, why do artifacts matter in general? Well, historians need them. Historians can use a lot of different methods to understand the past, but having something that was actually in somebody's hand in the past can be really powerful, because artifacts can tell stories that might otherwise be forgotten or left out about stories about the past. If historians didn't have artifacts, then it might be hard for them to understand what the life of sort of an average everyday person was like in a time before a lot of average everyday people could read or write about their experiences. Artifacts also matter because they can be interpreted in many different ways. So, unlike a history textbook where students might be handed something where the history has already kind of been interpreted for them, individual people who want to understand history, teachers, students, citizens, can look at artifacts and interpret them on their own. Artifacts can represent really complicated ideas and perspectives and moments in time in the form of one simple object. So we can really understand a lot about very complicated world events by looking at small artifacts. And artifacts can be really powerful because they're these tangible, meaning you can hold them in your hands, very concrete ways that we can connect to the past and empathize with people who lived in the past and understand what they experienced. So you might think of these kinds of things when you hear artifact. Items from very, very long ago, hundreds and thousands of years ago, items that historians and archaeologists have to dig for and carefully handle and treat and analyze, and these certainly are artifacts. But artifacts can also be things like this: a book that represents a very specific moment in cultural time, a photograph of a relatively recent moment, but a moment that's in the past. This is a newspaper, the online version of the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from Friday, May 29th, 2020. An item that shows the kinds of food that some people eat, right? Like a bag of Takis. This is an advertisement for the first iPhone, right? Not that long ago, but this is a really important object that has shaped a lot of people's lives. Someone's daily schedule or planner or to-do list doesn't seem super exciting, but for a future historian, that would give them a great idea of how normal people spend their time and their days. So artifacts are not just things like this, things that are old and buried in layers of dirt and soil. Artifacts can be this, things that we might use or see or interact with on a daily basis. So you have artifacts that might help future historians in understanding COVID-19 and its impacts on our lives. I'm not saying you might have, or you probably have, or maybe you have. I'm pretty confident that everyone has some kind of an artifact that might help future historians in understanding this current pandemic. So to identify some of these artifacts, think about the parts of your life that have changed because of COVID-19. Now, for a lot of us, that is a very long list. So try to pick out a few. We all know our school life has changed because of COVID-19. Probably the ways that you think about just leaving your house have changed. Maybe there are things that you grab now that you wouldn't ordinarily. The ways that you interact with friends has probably changed, right? There are all of these different areas of our life that have changed. The ways you and your family buy and prepare food even might have changed over health concerns. When you think about the past several months, are there specific events or moments that come to mind? Maybe the moment you found out that MRH schools would be closed for the rest of the school year sticks out to you. Or maybe there was a moment where you heard some really great news related to progress against the coronavirus, progress towards a vaccine that stand out to you. And think about new items and habits and people and places that have become a part of your life because of COVID-19 and all of the sort of shutdowns it has caused. Are there new places that you go that you didn't before? Are there new habits that you've incorporated into your day-to-day life? For a lot of people, one simple example of a habit that's changed would be hand washing. A lot of people are much more proactive about washing hands and doing so properly now, right? So when you start to think about some of the concrete ways that this global event has changed your life, you probably also start to think about some specific artifacts. Maybe a face mask comes to mind. Maybe an empty bottle of hand soap comes to mind because of all that hand washing we have to do. Maybe text messages with or emails with a teacher come to mind. Maybe text messages with a friend come to mind because you have to find different ways to communicate with people now that we're no longer spending so much time physically together. So once you start to think about the specific ways that your life has been shaped by this, hopefully there are some specific items, even if those items are something like a text message or an email, something that you can't hold in your hands, hopefully there are some specific examples of artifacts that come to mind. So now we can think about written documents, texts, emails, letters, to-do lists, grocery lists, images, maybe photos on a phone or a device of some kind, maybe drawings that you've done, and objects, the face mask, the empty bottle of hand sanitizer, some other object that represent these big changes in your life and that show either what's been important to you during this time and what's given you hope, and or that maybe show the challenges that we've experienced during this time. So in addition to picking 2 to 5 of your own artifacts, you'll write a short description and explanation for each, just kind of telling what it is, briefly thinking about who, what, when, where it represents, explaining your personal connection to the artifact, and explaining how the artifact connects to the COVID-19 pandemic. So here's an example. Now, this is a written document, right, because these are words written down, but this wasn't written on physical paper. This was typed by me and other 6th grade teachers into the It's Learning platform on our laptops. But I took a screenshot, and I'm counting this as an artifact. So this is the teacher's view of a reading lesson in It's Learning. Now, my description and explanation is where I tell why it is that that's an artifact that shows something about this period in history. So I said this artifact shows a written lesson plan on It's Learning, the online learning platform My School, located in Richmond Heights, Missouri, because again, I want to tell about where this is happening, started using during remote learning. Our physical school closed because of COVID-19, so we began to teach and learn online. So far, I'm just describing what this is, what it has to do with COVID-19. I'm explaining that we were doing this because of COVID-19 and because our physical school was closed. Now I start giving my sort of personal connection. It was very challenging to start teaching remotely, and it was really sad to be teaching without seeing students every day. This artifact shows our first ever reading lesson planned for students in It's Learning. Over the 9 weeks we spent doing remote learning through the end of the school year, remote teaching got easier, but never really felt normal. So this is a mix of, again, just kind of factual description of what the artifact is and how it connects to COVID-19, and some of my personal reflection on why I selected this, why this is so powerful to me. As a teacher, this became a pretty big part of my life because of COVID-19, and it was not really a part of my life before. And I'm sure that a lot of you feel the same way about It's Learning, right? So I said 2 to 3 here. You can do as many as you would like. 2 to 3 is probably a reasonable amount of artifacts to identify. And in addition to picking those artifacts, you'll write just a short description and explanation. And again, the goal here is to think about what future historians might want to learn about what it's like to be a person during this pandemic. So whether you're identifying written documents, images, objects, you might even create some of these things with this perspective in mind. So you might create a drawing that represents how you felt when you learned that school would be closed for the rest of the year, right? Whether or not you're finding them or creating them, that's the goal, is to think about artifacts with future historians and future generations in mind. So we are living through a wild time in history that is affecting everyone around the world. But even though this is such a big issue that affects everyone, your individual story still matters. And your individual story can still be important for future historians who are trying to understand this, okay? So have fun thinking creatively about how you can help to tell that story to future historians. Find those few artifacts that could teach a future historian about your unique experience during this pandemic. And I'm excited to see what you all come up with, okay? Have fun.